Modern historians have revised, rewritten, and even deleted entire chapters of American history. So what are we missing? What happened to the history that didn't make the books? Join historian David Barton, Tim Barton, and special guests as they uncover the facts some historians don't want you to know. This is America's Hidden History.
Hi, I'm Tim Barton with Wall Builders. Welcome to America's Hidden History, where we uncover events and the people who shaped them. Today's episode focuses on American presidents and President's Day. We'll specifically highlight the Washington era, Lincoln era, and the presidents of World War II. This is America's Hidden History.
Welcome to another episode of America's Hidden History. I'm David Barton, and with me is Tim Barton, president of Wall Builders, and our special guest, Stephen Mansfield, historian, author, number of books. We're going to be covering President's Day today. We're going to look at presidents, from early presidents up through the present. And actually, Stephen, you've done a lot of writing on presidents. You've done a couple dozen books and a number on presidents, and Lincoln and others as well. So we're going to have a lot of fun with you today.
I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
And let's get started kind of with what we've got around. You see a lot of stuff on the set here, and as you look around the set, let's kind of take you through some of the stuff. We've got, for example, there's a lot of books that we'll get to later, but down in front, you've got George Washington here, and back here is Thomas Jefferson, and back there is John Adams. And Tim, you got some stuff over on your side as well?
Yeah, so up in the front, there's a drum that actually came from Mount Vernon, from George Washington's home. So it's actually a Revolutionary gun. Beside it, you have a cannonball beside it also. We have all kinds of different artifacts from George Washington and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson up here on the table. Presidential proclamations from these guys, different speeches, different letters. So a lot of stuff we can get into and talk about.
Well, let's talk about, I mean, all these guys were involved in the American Revolution. So let's go back to the American Revolution for a bit. Freedom was won by soldiers on the ground doing some real things. So let's get a volunteer to come up and let's talk to somebody.
Okay. Hey, I'm Tim.
I'm Zara.
Zara, nice to meet you. Okay.
Hey, Zara, come on over.
We'll start on this side.
First off, how tall are you?
5'4".
You're perfect. That's a soldier in the American Revolution, 5'4". Now, if you're in the Revolution, you're fighting, you've got to have a gun. So let's get you a gun, and you need a gun to be able to fight with. So take that. You know how to shoot a gun?
Yes, sir.
Okay, let's see you put that on your shoulder and what you can do with it.
It's kind of big.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do.
See if you can put that up on your shoulder.
You get it up. We'll help hold it for you. Oh, my goodness.
It's really heavy.
Yeah. Don't drop it on stuff.
Now, what you need to do is you got to fight battles with that. You're only going to have to march 40 to 50 miles a day carrying that.
You can
and you're going to have a wool jacket when you do it and all your camp gear. So that's a little start for what it would have been like to be in the American Revolution.
So does that seem bigger maybe than one of the guns you've shot?
A bit, yeah.
A little heavier? Yeah, Zara, thank you for helping. All right, we need somebody else, and actually, we have something else to look at. It's a little bigger, so why don't you come up and help us? Okay, this is a 43-pound mortar. You got it? Okay. Yeah. Now, we didn't get to meet you. What's your name?
Jimmy.
Jimmy, and normally you don't sound strained when you say your name, but holding 43 pounds is a little heavy, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can you roll that forward so they can see? There's a hole in the front of it where you would fill this with powder. You would then put a fuse in it. You put it in the mortar, shoots it off, and hopefully it explodes over the enemy as it goes. Maybe you could just throw that for us, right? You look pretty strong. Could you launch it? No? It's pretty heavy?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, Jimmy, this actually was in the last major battle of the Revolution. This came from the Battle of Yorktown. So this is a pretty, not just heavy piece of history, but a pretty significant piece. But thank you for coming and looking at that, taking a guess for it. Yeah, Jimmy, appreciate it. All right, and I need one more guy. So over here on this side, what do you think this is?
A compass.
Now, we didn't meet you yet. What's your name?
Philip.
Philip. Okay, Philip, what do you think this is?
A compass.
A compass. Okay, do you know what George Washington did in his early life for his profession? Before he's really an officer in the military, do you know what he did?
He's a surveyor.
He's a surveyor. This was his surveyor's compass that he used. And actually, so if you hold it up on the side, right, you can kind of look up, and That was his lines. So this was George Washington's surveying compass. Nice to meet you. Thanks for helping guess what this was. So certainly a lot of fun stuff from history, a lot of artifacts, but really in the midst of all of this, there's a lot of myths that are put out there today about presidents, right? Stephen, you've written a lot about some of these and some of your books, which I've really enjoyed reading. But one of the myths we hear a lot is about George Washington, and we hear today that George Washington wasn't a Christian. We hear that George Washington was a deist, that George Washington really didn't believe in Jesus or a God that was involved.
But the fact is, George Washington was a man who was a vestryman, or sort of an elder, of his Episcopal Church for years. He kept a journal of prayer. He bought a New Testament every single year for his wife on her birthday because she would read the Bible through in a year and wear it out. So it became a thing between the two of them. I'll buy you a Bible every year on your birthday. So he was absolutely a Christian, absolutely devoted to a Christian worldview. And the evidence is there. We just don't teach it anymore.
The cool thing about that era was they wrote everything down. Today, we record everything. You know, like we got our smart devices recording. They recorded too, but they did it in pen and paper. And by the way, here's one of George Washington's original letters. And so you take his handwritten letters, and there's about 40,000 letters that George did. So you take his handwritten letters, and what you do is you collect all these, and you come out with this in 1832. That's the first set of George Washington's writings. Everything they found, everything they could find a record of, they had it there. Now, it's grown over the years. Today, it's nearly 100 volumes of the papers of George Washington, but we start with 12 volumes here. And from those 12 volumes, you then get this book that comes out a couple of decades later. They've gone through all the volumes and said, man, Washington has some smart stuff to say. And so this guy, John Frederick Schroeder, it's called the Maxims of Washington, his political, social, moral, and religious maxims. And he's taken all the wise statements he's got and put them together. And at the beginning of each section, he always has people who knows George Washington introduce Washington. And so when he gets back to his religious maxims, there's a section on Christianity. And in that section, it's introduced by guys who knew Washington. One, Jeremiah Smith, who was actually a soldier with Washington in the Revolution. He's a guy that Washington made a federal judge. You have Chief Justice John Marshall, who was actually an aide-de-camp to Washington in the Revolution. So you got all these guys that know Washington. And they all say, oh, he was a strong, he was really a Christian.
A sincere believer in the Christian faith. The general was a Christian. So even on this painting up here of George Washington, there's actually two people in the painting. There's George Washington, and then over on the side is a guy named Isaac Potts.
Little face over on the side, see that?
Isaac Potts is the guy on the side.
He's not a real guy. He's a made-up guy. He's not real.
That is what people argue today. It seems silly, right?
Don't listen to him.
No. Except for...
This is the land deed with... Oh, look at there.
Right over here it says
Isaac Potts.
Isaac Potts.
So he's real.
He's a real guy.
Apparently, or it's a really good forgery from a long time ago. No. Well, so Isaac Potts, the reason this painting was done, and there's a lot of paintings of George Washington kneeling down and praying. It was something that many generals throughout the Revolution reported seeing Washington pray, that Washington was a man of prayer. So that was not an unusual thing at all. People knew that. Well, this painting was done depicting an account that was told because this man, Isaac Potts, had allegedly seen Washington, had this encounter with him, and Isaac Potts was a Quaker. So this Quaker is walking through the woods, hears something in the woods. He stops and listens because this is time of war. And so I'm just curious what's going on. Well, he starts walking through the woods to investigate. As he gets back, he sees, he thought it was multiple people having a conversation. It was only one man, and the one man was actually kneeling down praying. And so he stopped and just listened for a little while. Listened enough, apparently, so he then turns and leaves and goes home. And when he gets home, apparently he goes in, he opens the door, he goes into the kitchen table, he sits down, he puts his elbows on the table, he buried his head in his hands, and then he explains, I just came from the woods and I saw the commander of the American forces praying. When a man prays like that, his prayers are going to be answered. The war is over, it's over, the war is all over. Now, what's interesting about that is you have a guy convinced the war has already been decided based on the prayer life of Washington.
No, the prayer life of the deist, I'll point out.
Well, yeah, so, you know, but even today, some historians dispute the idea that Isaac Potts was a real person, which clearly he was a real person, or the details of the story.
And can I point out that if you want to go to Valley Forge, you can go visit the Isaac Potts home that is at Valley Forge, the stone home that still exists where he lived?
Well, and so even if there was some dispute over the integrity of all of the story of Isaac Potts, there's no dispute over the fact that Washington was known for being a man of prayer. And certainly a deist, and at least in today's interpretation, a deist believed that God doesn't get involved in the world.
That's right.
So why would you pray to a God who doesn't get involved? It doesn't make any sense when Washington was known as a man of prayer.
Well, and this is what I really want our young audience to know, and that is that modern historians have no problem simply cutting the religious content out of our American history. For example, Christopher Columbus said he sailed to the New World because the Holy Spirit guided him. He was guided by the Scriptures very clearly. And yet I can show you 4-volume histories and biographies of Christopher Columbus that never mention his faith, never mention that he was even a Christian. So make sure that you go to the original sources. Make sure that you're not looking at a modern version that might exclude his faith when an older version captures the truth about George Washington. You got to be aware of that. It's not that they set out to deceive you. They either don't believe religion's important or they just have a bias against it that causes them to filter it out. So go to the original sources, because that's where you find the rich stuff these guys are talking about.
Well, and when you go to original sources, you find things like this is the very first ever presidential prayer proclamation was done by George Washington. Now, again, if he's a deist, he's not going to be this guy calling the nation to pray for God's involvement or thanking God for his involvement. But this is the very first ever presidential prayer proclamation done by George Washington, again indicating he certainly was a man of faith, as is seen from original documents.
Well, other presidents did the same. I mean, we have President John Adams back here, and John Adams called himself, this is what he called himself. He said, "I am a church-going animal."
And as you mentioned, John Adams also has prayer proclamations as president, and certainly, you know...
Now, what year is that one?
This is down here in 1799.
And that's the original. That's the original from 1799.
And when you go back and maybe watch the HBO, right, did a special on John Adams, which was cool that they actually went back to history and said, let's learn somebody. But in the whole special, they never really brought up his faith, which it's hard to study John Adams and not see his faith, even in his letters to his wife. He talked about faith quite often. But somehow we left that out of the HBO TV special.
What they assume is that this is just politicians talking. This is just politicians making speeches. Oh, we invoke the blessings of the Almighty and all that kind of thing. But the reality is, like you say, when you get into their private letters, when you get into the advice they write their children or the correspondence with their wives, you find that faith is genuine. It's not just political speak. So these men really were devoted to God and devoted to God's purposes for this country.
Well, and one that today, you know, as we talked about, we have Washington, Adams, well, even Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is the guy that probably gets villainized the most today, especially
on
with
the faith aspects.
Because that's right. I mean, he's the guy that you know, wrote the letter Separation of Church and State. He's the guy that, you know, had the Jefferson Bible. There's a lot of things we hear about Jefferson that are seeming anti-faith, until you study Jefferson as a whole. When you get the whole picture, you go, wait a second, I don't think he's really anti-faith the way we present him today.
You're right. I mean, Jefferson gets presented as the most anti-religious founding father, he and Thomas Paine. And it's an interesting thing because what we have right here, for example, that's called the John Thompson Hot Press Bible. That's printed in 1798. Thomas Jefferson helped fund the printing of that Bible. Now, if Thomas Jefferson is the anti-religious, I hate the Bible guy, what's that? And by the way, this bottom stack over here, that's a Thomas Scott Bible. It's actually an 8-volume Bible. We've got 3 volumes of it there just for space, but it's 8 volumes. Thomas Jefferson helped fund the Thomas Scott Bible.
Now, if Jefferson's funding Bibles, I thought Jefferson cut out everything he didn't believe in.
That's what we hear.
Not true.
I know I say that right tongue-in-cheek because I know he didn't.
Right.
But that's what we hear today, is that Jefferson didn't believe in all the Bible, so he made his own Bible and he cut out things that he thought weren't true. So what's the answer behind that?
Here's the expert.
Well, you have 2 answers. One is he did 2 Jefferson Bibles. People, they talk about the Jefferson. I have fun when professors do that.
Is that like Old and New Testament?
Yeah, exactly. They say, oh, the Jefferson Bible said, what are you talking about? Well, you know, where he cut out all the miraculous, all the stuff he disagreed with. He cut all that out. I said, really? I said, which one? What do you mean, which one? There's only one. No, there's 2 Jefferson Bibles. You got 1804, 1820. So it already tells me they don't have a clue what they're talking about. And then I say,
at least when it comes to knowledge of Jefferson,
that's right? That's right.
They think they know something. They've got this smoking gun, and it turns out, oh, wait, there's There was 2 different things he did? I had no idea.
And that's one of the fun things. You just start asking questions. You find out that they think they know what they know, but they don't. And so you say, which one? And they don't. I say, well, have you ever read the Jefferson Bible? Well, no. Well, how do you know it cut it out? Well, that's what everybody says.
Because the 1804 was actually an abridgment of the Gospels for use in witnessing
in
the
the title, it
Indians.
says, taken from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And it was because in 1803 he had read a sermon by a guy from Scotland and said, you know, if you want to reach the American Indians with the gospel, don't give them the Bible. I mean, they might read Leviticus or might read the genealogies. Give them the Gospels of Jesus. And Jefferson thought, good idea. And so he took 2 Bibles he had in the White House. He went through and did what we would call a red letter version. He took the teachings of Jesus, cut them all out, pasted them end to end. He gave it to an Indian missionary friend and said, look, here's the teachings of Jesus. You can print this a whole lot cheaper and you print a whole Bible, and this is where the Indians need to start. It says an abridgment of the Gospels for the use of the Indians.
So we've already clarified what it's for, and he says in only choosing things that would be to their level of understanding, to not challenge them in a level of theology where they're going, wait a second, that doesn't make sense. So just to give them enough they can go, oh, Jesus, this is who this is. And so,
and by the way, he covers heaven. The teachings cover heaven and hell, healing the sick, raising the dead, casting out demons. You know, he cut out all that supernatural stuff.
Jesus is the Son of God. Right. He is supernatural. He does the miraculous, which is what we're told Jefferson cut out. Well, that's the first one. The second one is the 1820 version.
And this is that one. This is this 1820 version. Jefferson actually said, if everybody would live by the teachings of Jesus, we'd need a whole lot less government. Yep. So he went through and found 81 moral teachings of Jesus. He cut those teachings out of the Bible, pasted them end to end so that he could read the morals of Jesus. And it's actually in his handwriting. This is a reprint that was done of it. But as you go, you can see his handwriting. It's the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth. And Congress printed 9,000 copies. This is one of the original 1902 copies. It's printed by the U.S. Government Printing Office. For 50 years, they gave this to every member of Congress, said if you'll live by the teachings of Jesus, you won't get in trouble.
I live just a few miles from the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. And today, of course, if you had a church service in the U.S. Capitol, people would go crazy and you're violating separation of church and state. But Jefferson actually made it possible to have a worship service going on every Sunday morning in the U.S. Capitol. He attended that worship service, and he also paid out of his own pocket for the Marine Band to play at the church service. Now, you might not want the Marine Band playing at your church service.
Yeah, Marine Band is your worship band at church?
That would fit our style.
That seems like he's violated the separation of church and state, though.
Well, that says something. The guy who's supposed to have written the words did write the words.
Didn't he know what he wrote?
Of course he knew what he wrote.
Was he confused about this?
He wasn't crazy. He just didn't see it as a violation of the law. And we have hilarious records, by the way, of him having his feet stepped on while he's in church and having a Quaker woman give a prophecy. And he's going, what's going on here? Like some of us have to do in our churches. But my point is that here's Thomas Jefferson sponsoring a worship service, sponsoring a church basically meeting in the U.S. Capitol. Now that says about everything you need to know about what his intentions were.
Well, and so to the notion that many of the founding fathers were atheists, agnostics, and deists, when you study the original writings, you just don't come to that conclusion, which even going back, so we talked about this 12-volume set of Washington's writings, with Jared Sparks being the guy that collects it. One of the things that Jared Sparks, this historian putting it together, does is he actually writes to Washington's granddaughter, Nellie, who ended up being the adopted daughter, right, lives with Washington, grows up in their home, and says, well, what can you tell me about the faith of Washington? What she says is, because Jared was asking about the Christian faith, and she said, you should sooner question his patriotism than his Christianity. Now, I don't know any historian that questions the patriotism of George, the father of the nation, the guy really leading in the revolution. Nobody questions his patriotism. And yet, for some reason today, we question his Christianity when everybody that knew him says, no, he was a Christian. But again, it goes back to this notion when people say, well, no, founding fathers weren't Christians. They didn't believe in God. Well, everybody that knew them seemed to think they did.
Nellie gave a bunch of examples of why you might as well question his patriotism instead of Christianity. She said on one occasion that her aunt died. And she was lying there at the couch at Mount Vernon in front of the fireplace, and Washington saw her, and she was really sick. Washington didn't realize she had died, thought she was just resting and sleeping. Nellie says he went over and laid hands on her and prayed for her, not realizing she'd already passed, but praying that God would heal her. And that's not the kind of stuff you get from a deist.
Yeah, a deist wouldn't do that.
You know, that's just...
No. But, so as we mentioned, you know, for a younger audience who is possibly hearing some of this for the first time, the important thing of going back to original sources and finding the truth, not just somebody's impression, because even as we're saying this, we would counsel them kind of like, you know, what when Paul in the book of Acts praises the Bereans, because as he's explaining the gospel to them, they go, wait a second, somebody go get the scroll of Isaiah. Let's make sure this guy knows what he's talking about. We would even say for us, don't just take our word for it. Go back and see the original writings. So guys, clearly we've seen with kind of this first myth that George Washington was not a Christian. We would say that was wrong, right? That's kind of fake history, because everybody at his time that knew him said, no, this guy's a Christian.
As a matter of fact, Tim, this is a piece from the Reverend John Leland. And John Leland knew Washington well. He's one of the preachers behind the First Amendment of the Constitution. And this little piece right here, several pages, is titled Washington and Christ, his two good friends. 56 stanzas about Washington and Christ from a guy who personally knew George Washington.
So again, the confirmation is the people that knew Washington says this guy's a Christian. So we can say that first myth has been exposed, that Washington was in fact a Christian. The second myth revolves around somebody you've done a lot of research on, Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War, but we need to go to the other side of the studio. So let's get on across the studio.
Let's do it.
Okay, we've dispatched the myth that George Washington was a deist. Not true, he was a Christian. But we've also got another myth that's out there. As a matter of fact, in recent years, we've seen even college kids having protests to take down the statues of Abraham Lincoln because he's a slave owner and pro-slavery. Not true. Now, we've got Stephen Mansfield, this historian, Tim Barton, president of Wall Builders. And Stephen, you've got a great book on Lincoln's battle with God. We're going to talk about Lincoln particularly, but kind of around us, we've got a picture of Abraham Lincoln back here. This is John Quincy Adams right here, 6th president. He really doesn't belong in the Civil War kind of era, but he had a huge impact on this era. That's James A. Garfield over here on this side. He was in the Civil War, knew Lincoln well, became the 20th president. Lincoln was the 16th president. But that picture of Lincoln's fairly interesting. This is the same, except this is a lot smaller. And this picture actually belonged to the guy who did the Lincoln Memorial. So when you see the pictures of Lincoln in the memorial, this is a picture that he had in doing that. But what's even cooler is this is the negative from which it was made. Wow. And so that glass negative, and it's this kind of camera over here, and there's some John Quincy Adams documents right here, for example. This is the reverse image of President Lincoln. Over there is some James A. Garfield. So, by the way, President Garfield, 20th president, this was the paging system that sat on his desk. So you can call someone from the next room to come in, and John Quincy Adams, that's some more stuff off the desk of Garfield as well. And Tim, you got some stuff over there?
Yeah, so letters from Garfield, a lot of things from John Quincy Adams. So up here we have a lot of things from presidents of that era, and actually a few things probably worth talking about. So our first volunteer, we already asked if you would come up. We have something we want you to check out and see if you can figure out, what it is. Now, what's your name?
Start?
Paul.
Paul? Okay.
All right, Paul, you're wearing glasses. If you will, take your glasses off and
I can hold
very
those for you.
carefully slip those glasses on. See if it does anything for you.
Makes everything blurrier.
Put them back on again.
You look great in them, though.
That's the way that President Zachary Taylor saw the world, because those are presidential glasses of President Zachary Taylor. I'm not going to let you sit in it, but that's his chair over there from the White House, President Zachary Taylor.
So you've now worn presidential glasses. Yeah. I don't know if you felt executive-ish. Okay, well, thank you. So you got to check out glasses. There's a lot of cool stuff, and we could even do some more looking and guessing at what stuff is. But kind of the bottom line with this section really does revolve a lot around Abraham Lincoln. Today, as you already mentioned, where people think that he wasn't anti-slavery, and so many things that get said about it, even his faith, which you did a great job unfolding. But with Lincoln, now we're being told he wasn't even against slavery. How do we respond to that? How do we answer that question about Lincoln when it comes to slavery?
Well, it's sad that people aren't seeing this correctly, because in his early life, Lincoln definitely had some of the racist attitudes of the times, and he said some things people quoted, and so people assume he wasn't anti-slavery. But that's just ridiculous. The fact is he had anti-slavery sentiments from a very young age. He was in Congress for about 18 months, and during that time, he proposed legislation to make Washington, D.C. anti-slavery. It's the first time he ever proposed any legislation related to slavery. He was absolutely opposed to slavery.
Well, and certainly even looking at being a member member of the Republican Party. That was part of their party
This is
position.
a platform all the time.
This is the actual Dred Scott decision that the Supreme Court came out with that said, oh, the blacks, no black man has any rights which a white man is bound to respect. That then became something that was handed out with the Democrat Party platform for the next election that said, see, we were right about slavery. We told you slavery was good for everybody. And the Supreme Court actually said that slavery is for the benefit of blacks. It's for the benefit of society and it helps blacks. And so Democrats with their platform put it out. Well, the Republicans said, not us. And so this is the first Republican platform, 1856. It is only 9 planks long, and 7 of the 9 planks are, we want to end slavery, give equality, give equal civil rights. They did not win that election of 1856. The next election was 1860. They did win this one. This is the one on which Abraham Lincoln ran as a Republican in a brand new party. And the Republican Party was started by 30 anti-slavery Democrats who no longer felt at home in their own party. So they started a new party. And anti-slavery, he runs as president, gets elected. This is a huge, and there's 17 planks here, huge anti-slavery platform. And then 4 years later, this is the 1864 platform of the Republicans and the Democrats, and so voters would know where the parties are on all the issues. And right here, the Republican Party calls for a constitutional amendment to permanently ban slavery. We're not going to do abolition stuff anymore. We're not going to gradually work. We just want it gone. And that's what Lincoln runs on. That's what he gets reelected on. This is the 13th Amendment, and this is the amendment that abolishes slavery after 240 years. According to the Constitution, in any constitutional amendment, you get 2/3 of the House and Senate to pass it and 3/4 of the states, and that's it. Precedent has nothing to do with any constitutional amendment, except in the 13th Amendment, Abraham Lincoln put his signature on it because he wanted the world to know, I am anti. He didn't need to, didn't have to. There's no other president, there's no other amendment signed by any president. He put it on the 13th Amendment to say, look, this is not part of my constitutional duty. I'm telling you, I hate slavery. I want it ended. And so he signs the 13th Amendment.
Well, it's just ignorance. The idea that Abraham Lincoln wasn't anti-slavery. The Civil War basically begins when Abraham Lincoln gets elected and the southern slave states then leave the Union. And they do that. Why? Because Abraham Lincoln is opposed to slavery and therefore they don't want to be in a union that opposes slavery. So he was the symbol at that time, politically, of anti-slavery sentiment. That's why the nation divided. That's why we had to fight a war. So you have to be pretty ignorant to think that he's not anti-slavery. It's just obvious.
How much of that was related to faith? Because his faith journey was pretty wild.
Abraham Lincoln's faith journey is so fascinating. And when people say he's not a Christian, wasn't a believer, it's sad because it was such a slow, painful journey for him. Let me tell the story very quickly. Abraham Lincoln was born to a Christian family, but his father was the kind of man, and this was during a great revival called the Second Great Awakening. His father was the kind of man who would get weepy about Jesus at dinner, but then beat his children the next day. That's the sad origins of Abraham Lincoln. So Abraham Lincoln distanced himself from Christianity, and in the early phase of his adult life, around the age of 21, he became, in New Salem, a place called New Salem, he became the village atheist. He argued against religion. He had read Paine and Volney and Gibbon and a lot of the main skeptics at that time. So he was known as the village atheist. He'd walk around with the Bible under his arm just to pick fights about it and argue with people about it on the streets, no question. But eventually he went into the Illinois legislature, he moved to Springfield, and he began to meet Christians who could give a reason for the hope that was within them, who could articulate Christianity, who could explain it in rational terms, not just kind of emotional, revivalistic terms. And so he began to change. Unfortunately, what really turned Abraham Lincoln were the deaths that he suffered in his life. Abraham Lincoln was a manic depressive. That's the phrase we would use today. He almost killed himself several times. His friends had to stand suicide watch. And so it was while Lincoln battled his way out of grief that he came back to his faith. I don't know if you can remember that his mother died when Abraham Lincoln was only 9 years old. His sister died when he was 16. The first love of his life died when he was in his early 20s. There were other deaths in his life. Of course, he got married to Mary Todd Lincoln, as we've discussed, and he lost children. He had several sons die, and the grief that he suffered over that was just horrible. The man who made the difference was a man named Reverend Smith, and Reverend Smith ministered to Lincoln in the midst of his grief, and that's really what gives us the Abraham Lincoln that we have when Abraham Lincoln arrives at the Oval Office. And so we actually have a document here. Go ahead and tell them about it.
This is from Reverend Smith talking about Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
And Reverend Smith relates that as the Bible Society annual meeting was in town, he wanted Abraham to speak to the Bible Society meeting. And Abraham says, nah, I don't want, yeah, you're great. Nah, I don't want, yeah, you're great. And so he records that Abraham Lincoln gave this killer speech on the 10 Commandments and how relevant they are today and how to live by the 10 Commandments. And so this is the pastor you're talking about. This is the pastor that really kind of took him in a different direction.
When you have Abraham Lincoln in the White House, by that time, he has become the very religious, very spiritual man that we now know. But I want you to always remember that Abraham Lincoln went through almost a decade where he was a confessed atheist. The thing that you have to lean to is that when you read, again, as we were speaking of earlier, original documents, when you read the magnificent second inaugural address, which was given just a few weeks, in fact, before Abraham Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater, it's one of the great American political sermons. It quotes scripture. It reframes the American Civil War in divine terms. What is God doing? Lincoln's come to the conclusion by the end of the war that God had visited the Civil War on the nation in punishment for slavery and her other sins. And so whatever you do with Abraham Lincoln's life, and I'm speaking of secular scholars here, you have to honor the fact that this magnificent sermon quoting scripture and invoking God's will in the earth is at the end of his life. So you have to have a progression getting him from his atheistic period to this magnificent time when he's this strong believer in God's providence. I get a little ticked off when people go around talking about him not being a believer, because if he was sitting back here in this chair, he'd say, you know, finding my faith again took a lot of dark nights of the soul and a lot of prayer and a lot of fighting through and a lot of battling my own darkness. So don't talk like I hadn't won that battle, because he had.
You can take a quote from early on when his father was beating him and say, look what Lincoln said, or you can take a quote right at the start of the Civil War, or you can look at all the quote. Is that the only thing he said about?
That's right.
And when you look at everything, and that's a problem we have today in academia, is we'll pick one quote out and say, that's the guy, or we'll take one source and say, that's the, no, you look at all the sources and you balance it together.
Right. Let me tell you a story that you probably never heard before about Abraham Lincoln. I can do it very quickly. On the day that Lincoln was shot, he and his wife went for a carriage ride, and they talked a bit about what they would do after the war. Well, that night they're sitting in Ford's Theater, and they're still having kind of a flirty, loving, connection with each other. They had been estranged a little bit during the war just because of pressure. And Lincoln turns to her and continues a conversation he had had in the carriage earlier that day. And he says to her, after the war, we will not go back to Springfield. We will travel abroad so I can rest. And he says these words. He says, I should so much like to go to the Holy Land. I should so much like to walk in the footsteps of the Master. After the war, we shall go to Jerusalem. Those are the last words he ever speaks in this life. John Wilkes Booth's Derringer ball fires into the back of his brain. Abraham Lincoln never speaks again. So not only do you have the second inaugural address, this powerful political sermon weeks before he dies, but the night he died, as he died, he was saying essentially, I want to walk in the footsteps of his master. And we get that story. I didn't make that up. That came from Mary Todd Lincoln, the only person sitting close enough to him to know. So again, these are stories that aren't told. Again, these come from the original documents, and I think that removes pretty much any doubt of where Abraham Lincoln was when he died.
His journey is so interesting, and one of the things you document so well in your book is his journey of faith. But in the midst of this journey, it's also amazing the people that it seems like divine providence, right, that God brings along the way. Because one of the guys we have a picture of is John Quincy Adams.
Yes.
And Abraham Lincoln served as congressman for one term.
Yes.
And during his one term, it's while John Quincy Adams is serving his last term. And John Quincy Adams is the leader of the anti-slavery movement. And Lincoln at this point has already said some things that would seemingly be anti-slavery, but it's certainly not as strong as he would be later in life.
No question.
But while he's in Congress, he listens to John Quincy Adams getting up and giving these impassioned speeches about the evils of slavery and what we should do and how we should end it. John Quincy Adams, no doubt, has an influence on Abraham Lincoln.
Well, Abraham Lincoln became a pallbearer for John Quincy Adams. When John, I mean, of all the famous, he's a president of the United States. Before this, he's a U.S. senator. He's a foreign diplomat to 5 different nations. He's a secretary of state. He has ended wars. He can get anybody in the world to be his pallbearer. And this young freshman kid, Abraham Lincoln, that nobody even knows about, is the pallbearer because of the connection that's already been formed there.
Over anti-slavery sentiment.
But again, it's the faith of these guys motivated them to do what they do. You see then Abraham Lincoln is influenced by these guys of faith to do what he does. It's amazing when you see the big picture full story, how God just really kind of weaved things together.
Let's take another one, because Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, I mean, he's got military problems. McClellan's a big pain. He has to get rid of McClellan and get U.S. Grant in there. He's also got a lot of political problems in Congress. And so he reaches into one of his major generals, which is that guy right there. James A. Garfield was a hero, a war hero. And Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, says, help back here at Congress. So this man comes back to Congress, helps. He then is key in passing the first 23 civil rights laws in America, because we do end up abolishing slavery, Lincoln, the 13th Amendment, then 23 laws get passed, all sorts of equality. And so he's a key guy, and he actually helps found one of the first black universities in America. But it's interesting that this guy, before he was a military officer, was a preacher of the gospel. You've got an interesting letter there, Tim.
Yeah, so this is a letter from Garfield, and in this letter, he's recounting that he had just finished preaching at a revival service. And what he says in this letter is that he had preached 19 discourses.
So 19 sermons.
So 19 sermons. He says there were 34 additions, meaning 34 people got saved. He says, and I baptized 31 of them by immersion. So you have a guy who, military officer, right, gonna go on to be a president, who's also a preacher, who's leading people to Christ, baptizing them. I don't know many presidents that have done baptismal services, but certainly, again, I mean, as we're talking about the faith of our nation, right, our heritage, our hidden history, it really is amazing the Christian heritage is there.
So you look across this era, the second myth is that Abraham Lincoln is pro-slavery. Therefore, let's have protests, tear down statues of Abraham. Wrong. Dead wrong. Not only is he anti-slavery, he's a big God guy as he grows through life, as was John Quincy Adams and was James A. Garfield.
Sure.
There's another aspect we don't get either, and I want to just make sure that I mention it to you guys to inspire you, and that is how brilliant these people were. This gentleman, James Garfield, he actually developed, in addition to being a general and a preacher and a president and so on, he actually developed a proof for the Pythagorean theorem. Now, that's one of the great mathematical questions that you have since the ancient Greek world. He developed an additional proof for it to what we already had. That was in his spare time. By the way, he was completely self-educated. This was not a man who went to Harvard. You know,
he grew up in a log cabin. As a matter of fact, he's the last American president born in a log cabin.
Exactly. But he's studying so aggressively because he wants to serve God with his intellect that he's actually confirming Greek theories of mathematics. So I want you to be aware that if you hear these guys were born in log cabins, or you hear that they were self-educated, don't put that down. They were brilliant people, Lincoln included, and the accomplishments of these two are pretty stunning.
So we've gone through, we've seen that second premise out there that Lincoln's pro-slavery is not accurate. He was anti-slavery, and any notion that, like the Founding Fathers, these guys were atheists, agnostics, deists, not religious, they were presidents, they got to be secular. No, not so. These guys served God with their heart and their mind. They were brilliant guys. So let's kind of move out of this, and let's move into another big era of American history. That's the World War II era. Because now we're into a modern era where we really think government's supposed to be secular. That's certainly what we hear today. And we look back to World War II, and that's kind of secular as we look at it. But that's not really the way American history works. So let's go to a different part of the studio.
Let's do it.
Okay, we've covered some in the American founding, the American Revolution. We went over to the Civil War and looked at a lot of that era. We come more to contemporary America. And based on the experiences we have, based on so much of what we see in education, what we teach, not the faith of these guys, we've come to believe that government really is supposed to be a secular kind of a place. I mean, you don't want kids saying God at graduation or a nativity scene in public, so we squelch faith everywhere, and we just assume that government is to be something secular. But let me take us back a little bit. We have these presidents behind us. You have Franklin Roosevelt, you have Harry Truman, you have Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower. These three were all involved in really kind of what saved the world, World War II. And as you look at these guys, I want to take you through a few things with World War II, because you start with Pearl Harbor, December the 7th, 1941. Nobody expects it, and we get whacked with a surprise attack, kills 3,000 Americans. Everyone is shocked. There was no warning. As a matter of fact, the diplomats, Japanese diplomats in D.C. were supposed to be announcing this before the attack happened. It didn't happen, so it was a treacherous attack, as President Roosevelt called it, a day that will live in infamy. Well, from that point, you go over the next 4 days, there are 6 declarations of war, because we declare war on Japan, but Japan declares war on us. And Hitler says, well, if you're going after my friend Tojo, I'm going after you guys. And we say, all right, we're going after Hitler. And then Mussolini says, well, if you're going after my friends Tojo and Hitler, I'm going after you. All right, we'll go after you. So in 4 days, 6 declarations of war. And then 3 weeks later, President Roosevelt has to give the State of the Union address. And so America is now at a time of war, still a lot of shock with what's happened. We've not recovered anywhere close at Pearl Harbor, all the deaths. And I want you to hear what the President tells the nation on his televised State of the Union address. Listen to this.
The world is too small to provide adequate living room for both Hitler and God. In proof of that, the Nazis have now announced their plan for enforcing their new German pagan religion all over the world. The plan by which the Holy Bible and the Cross of Mercy would be displaced by Mein Kampf and the swastika and the naked sword.
Catch that contrast. Hitler versus God, and Hitler has a pagan religion, and he wants Mein Kampf to replace the Bible, and he wants the swastika and the naked sword to replace the cross of mercy. Now, interestingly, this is an original first edition of Mein Kampf signed by Hitler. So this is essentially his Bible for his pagan religion. And here President Roosevelt, and no one thinks of him as a Christian today. Of course he was, but no one thinks that way. And he's talking to the nation, making this a clear spiritual conflict. And as a result of what he said in that speech, we came out with the government printing this poster right here. This is printed by the government. It says, "This is the enemy." And you see the Nazi swastika, the naked sword stabbing the Bible. It says at the bottom, printed, the U.S. government printing office. I mean, look at the contrast. We're saying the U.S. government's printing posters that say, guys, anything that attacks the Bible is the enemy.
You have a lot of these religious posters that all came from the government printing office. So we weren't afraid to indicate that we believed in faith and religion.
Well, and this is a very, very important point. In the same way that we have to go back and realize that our American Revolution was viewed by the Minutemen and by the Patriots as being a spiritual war, a war about religious issues, and we can talk about that another time. World War II is without question viewed by the leaders and by the people as a conflict of religions. Not only did FDR say, look, this is paganism. The world's not big enough for both the Christian vision and paganism, as Hitler exemplifies it. Winston Churchill picked up this language. He talked about Nazism being darkest paganism, and he would talk about how the Christian nations need to rally to defeat this paganism. Now, this wasn't back 500 years ago. This was 1939, 1940, 1941. So that's how they thought. You don't hear that very much. You don't see it in the textbooks. But the fact is, they saw this as a war between rank, racist paganism and the Christian nations. Yeah. It changes our understanding of World War II.
And it's interesting that what happened was they would, if you went in the Army, they gave you a little book saying, this is the Army. And it went through all the guidelines. Here's how you get your checks sent home. Here's what you expect. You're going to have to go through boot camp and learn stuff. But they also gave every American recruit one of these. Now, these are all Bibles, and they're a little different. This one is called the Heart Shield Bible. If you can hear the sound of that, it's a steel plate on the front of it. It says, may this keep you from harm. It's a Bible. Recruits got that. They kept it in their breast pocket right here over their heart. I have talked to guys in World War II that bullets hit that, did not penetrate the steel, saved their life. One guy told me actually the bullet came partway out the back, so it hit his chest and bruised him, but it didn't go through the Bible. So it literally saved the lives. And it's interesting, on the inside of these Bibles, like here's one, you open it up, and on the inside, it has the American flag, and it has a letter from Franklin Roosevelt saying, guys, read the Bible. We're at war. Get into God's Word. This is what they gave to the Army, and here is what they gave to the Navy. And the Navy, you open it up, and it's got FDR's letter in there, but the difference is it has a Christian flag flying higher than the American flag. Now, if you showed that to Americans today, whoa, you can't do that.
Yeah, it seems to violate flag code, right?
Yeah.
Nothing flies higher than the American flag.
Well, interesting. Look at this footage from World War II. See, oh, look there. The Christian flag is flying higher than the American flag. In the flag code, the U.S. Navy, when you have the call for divine service, God goes above country, and that's still in the flag code to this day. So we don't recognize that, but we still acknowledge that God goes above country, and we think, well, government's supposed to be secular. Well, as we get all these recruits coming in, now we're gearing up for war, and you know, we're turning out bombers, we're turning out Liberty ships, and we're really getting things going. Now we recognize at some point we've got to invade Europe, and we're going to push Hitler back into Germany. Now, the only logical invasion point is to go those 23 miles across the English Channel, launch the ships, so the Germans know that that's where we're coming, what we call D-Day. So when D-Day is launched, and we're now putting this massive effort of thousands of ships and planes into going after Hitler, we're coming ashore in Europe, he announces it to the American people. And I want you to hear what he says when he announces this.
My fellow Americans, last night, when I spoke with you about the fall of Rome, I knew at that moment that troops of the United States and our allies were crossing the Channel in another and greater operation. It has come to pass with success thus far. And so, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join with me in prayer. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization, and to set free a suffering humanity. Lead them straight and true. Give strength to their arms, stoutness to their hearts, steadfastness in their faith.
The president leads the nation in prayer for 6.5 minutes for a live military action that's going at that very moment. So as they're invading, the whole nation's praying, and the president's the chief prayer leader. I thought government was supposed to be secular. Well, out of that, it's interesting that by Christmas time, that's where we get into the Battle of the Bulge, the presidential Christmas card from FDR in 1944 is right there behind you. You see the presidential seal up top. The Christmas card is the D-Day prayer. That was the White House Christmas card in 1944, was the D-Day prayer. Well, as we finally get kind of Germany pushed back into their own domains, and Hitler's there, FDR dies. He's not there for the end of the war, but Harry Truman is. And so Harry Truman is able to oversee the end of the war in Europe and finally get it ended in Japan. And when we got the war ended, like in Europe, Harry Truman, what's the response? It's right there. A proclamation to thank God, signed at the bottom by Harry Truman. And so when this war came to an end in Germany, 40 million lives later, it came to an end. What's the response? Time to thank God that this has come to an end. One of the things that FDR did, now he was president for 4 terms. Nobody's ever done that, which is why they amended the Constitution for only 2 terms. He had 4 terms, and every year on the anniversary of his inauguration, he went back to church and had a recommitment service to the Lord. One of those letters is inviting some of his generals to come to church with him on his recommitment.
Yeah, it was this one, inviting them to go to service with him.
That's right. And so what they did in January every year on the anniversary of the inauguration, they went back to church and said, rededicating to God again, and 4 terms of that, and that's from him. So as you go through those presidents and you finally get down to Eisenhower, Eisenhower was the guy running D-Day. I mean, he was the commander in Europe. And so as he becomes president, and now we're out of war, it's a time of peace, and so as you get through war, you kind of maybe forget God a little bit. And Eisenhower specifically said that as he was on his way to the inauguration, and he said that he had been to communion that morning, and he thought, you know, the nation's becoming too secular. What can I do to solve that? I'm not a preacher. I can't preach a sermon. look what he did to solve the concept of a secular nation on his inauguration. Watch this.
My friends, before I begin the expression of those thoughts that I deem appropriate to this moment, would you permit me the privilege of uttering a little private prayer of my own? And I ask that you bow your heads. Almighty God, as we stand here at this moment, my future associates in the executive branch of government join me in beseeching that thou wilt make full and complete our dedication to the service of the people in this throng and their fellow citizens everywhere. Give us, we pray, the power to discern clearly right from wrong, and allow all our words and actions to be governed thereby and by the laws of this land. Especially we pray that our concern shall be for all the people, regardless of station, race, or calling. May cooperation be permitted and be the mutual aim of those who, under the concepts of our Constitution, hold to differing political faiths, so that all may work for the good of our beloved country and thy glory. Amen.
That prayer he prayed is actually this prayer right here. So this is his actual handwritten prayer. That is, as we just listened, he's reading this.
That's what he
at
has
his
on
inauguration.
the podium reading.
And
that's what he was holding that day.
This is the actual handwritten prayer that he used at his inauguration. And again, as we're talking about this, you know, kind of the myth in this section is that a secular government is what we're supposed to have in America. It's what the founders intended. It works best. We should be secular. Well, they fought a war to make sure we weren't going to be secular, right? To make sure we weren't. Now, that doesn't mean that these guys were perfect in what they did, but they certainly weren't scared of religion and actually worked to include it in a lot of what they did.
Well, you know, with what he did, he said, I was concerned the nation was becoming too secular. So not only does he lead his own prayer, which try to find a president doing that, he leads his own prayer. He says, you know what, I think what we ought to do on the first Thursday of every February is start the Congressional Prayer Breakfast. We call it the National Prayer Breakfast. There's now about 6,000 to 8,000 people a year gather in Washington, D.C. on that day. 140 nations gather together to pray together. I cannot tell you literally how many senators that have been part of that who have said this civil war in this country was stopped because we got their leaders to come to Washington and pray together. So Eisenhower started that. Eisenhower is the guy who got under God put in the Pledge of Allegiance, because we didn't have it before that. He's the guy who said, why don't we codify that in God we trust is our national motto. And then on top of that, he said, you know, we got in God we trust on the coins, but not on the paper. Let's put it on the paper. Every piece of money coined in the Treasury, let's make sure it has I mean, this is Eisenhower, and he goes through his administration doing all these God things to make sure that America doesn't become secular. And today, that's just not the concept we have of presidents or what they do.
But I want to make a point, too, because we're talking about these men, these great men, their faith, and how it sustained them. And one of the tricks, one of the little tricks that are used, that's used when it comes to sort of sticking your finger in the eye of the faith of these men, when the critics want to say these guys weren't really Christians, they weren't really men of faith, and all throughout history, what they do is they look at the inconsistencies that might be in their personal character. You can always point at some president and say, well, he may have said he was a Christian, but he did this, he did that. And I can recite all of that for you and save you time. I mean, there's no question that FDR had an affair while in office. It's very well documented. Harry Truman used to cuss like a sailor and drink whiskey. If that diminishes him as a Christian, then you need to consider that. President Eisenhower, humorously, once declared a national day of prayer and fasting and then went out and played golf. He forgot what the day was, his own day. So these are flawed. We're all sinners. We're all flawed. Don't allow a criticism or an exposure of some issue of individual character to keep you from recognizing what these people believe. Because they did believe it, they did apply it to public policy, they did see their nation in those terms. That's what we're talking about.
Right, I mean, apart from Jesus, you're not going to find someone who doesn't have moral failings, so it would be foolish for us to be in that hypocritical sense going, now, wait a second, they have flaws, therefore, well, no, wait a second.
Some of them were very fierce in courage in standing for their faith. For example, Harry Truman was a Baptist. When John F. Kennedy ran for office, a lot of Baptists were upset that John F. Kennedy was Roman Catholic, and so they attacked him. Harry Truman stood up, wrote his entire Baptist denomination, said publicly, this is wrong. We should not be attacking this man because of his faith. Even though I don't agree with him religiously, I see his virtue as a man running for office. So here's Harry Truman taking a very unpopular stand within his own denomination because he believes that his own faith demands it.
But certainly, even in the midst of learning history, we're able to dispel some of these modern myths that, you know, no, our nation was supposed to have a secular government. The secular governments work best. Well, clearly, that's not what the guys who were fighting secular
governments thought. We can take those principles and apply them today. Is, you know what? It shouldn't be secular today either. It has worked well for 2 centuries. We're leading among the nations of the world in more stability. And it's because we had leaders who were not secular-minded, and we need that today.
Well, I've said that's probably worth asking the question, then, what do we do to make sure that we don't become secular, to make sure that we have leaders who, although are imperfect, are very God-conscious or pro-faith in the midst of office? So how do we maintain that?
Well, 2 things. First of all, know the story, tell the story. All that we're talking about, all of this, we're just, even though we've done a number of segments here, we're just scratching the surface of the great heritage of our nation. So know the story, tell the story. Repeat it in your home. Tell it at Thanksgiving. Tell it to your friends. But the other thing is, begin to look at our current politics and leaders and candidates you might be considering through the lens of faith. The reality is that if a candidate or a politician's faith is sincere, it will shape what they do in the Oval Office. And so ask their questions. What do they believe? What is their faith? And of course, people are going to act more like they're more faith-oriented when they're running for office, perhaps, than they have otherwise. So don't just look at their statements. Look at their life. Look at their history. How have they lived? What's been the fruit of their life? We need to be more faith-aware when it comes to our politics and not allow a kind of a secular veneer to sort of, you know, rob us of that great faith heritage, number one, but second of all, kind of a faith awareness in our current politics.
So with all we've covered, I mean, we've gone through 3 sections now. We've gone through the American Revolution, we've gone through the Civil War period, we've gone through World War II, the 20th century. One of the things that stands out is we haven't been great because we've been secular. It's these guys and their faith that has driven them. Some of our best leaders, we can disagree with them politically on things, but the tone they have kept of keeping God in America and keeping public policy reflecting that is something that we can take away from President's Day, is that we have a tremendous legacy of presidents who really have made sure that we are one nation under God. So we've talked about many American presidents today, and among other things, we've learned that George Washington actually was a devout Christian, that Abraham Lincoln never owned slaves, and he indeed was anti-slavery, and that government was not designed to be secular, and it doesn't work well when it is. So what we've seen and heard today only scratches the surface, and if you want more information about any of today's topics, I invite you to discover more hidden history at our website, wallbuilders.com. Or you can go to the App Store on your smart device and download the Wall Builders app, Fun American Facts About Presidents. Or you can visit our Wall Builders Facebook page and like us there. So be sure to stay tuned to TBN for more exciting chapters in America's hidden history.